January 5, 1943, off the coast of Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Red Cochrane stood behind his 5-inch 38 battery aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, watching 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bombers, VAL in Allied reporting nomenclature, complete their attack run and turn for home. The New Zealand cruiser Achilles had taken a hit. One of the VALs had scored. Now they were withdrawing, climbing, gaining distance from the task force they'd just blooded. Standard procedure dictated pursuit, fire, and harassment rounds to keep enemy pilots nervous during their retreat. Cochrane's gun crew had been briefed 3 months earlier about special projectiles they'd received in October. Mark 32 fuses. Don't ask how they work. Don't discuss them outside the battery. If you're captured, you know nothing about them. Fire them only over deep water where duds can't be recovered. The orders were clear. The explanation was not. If you're enjoying this deep dive and have invested your time this far, a quick like and subscribe takes just 2 seconds, but helps us create more content like this. Share this with any history enthusiast you know. Cochrane's crew loaded a mix. Half standard anti-aircraft rounds with mechanical time fuses. Half of these new shells with the Mark 32. The gun spoke. First salvo. Adjustment. Second salvo. Then something happened that shouldn't have been possible at that range, with that little time to aim. One of the VALs disintegrated mid-flight. Not from a direct hit, from a shell that exploded near it. Close enough that shrapnel from the burst-shredded control surfaces punched through the airframe, killed the crew. The bomber tumbled into the Pacific. Cochrane watched through binoculars as the pilot never even tried to recover. The aircraft simply fell, trailing smoke and aluminum fragments, hitting the water 3 miles from the task force. A kill at a range where mechanical time fuzzes required. Perfect range estimation, perfect angle calculation, perfect timing. Except Cochrane's crew hadn't calculated anything perfectly. They'd fired a spread, hoping one round would be close enough. And the shell had known. Somehow, impossibly, the projectile had sensed the target's proximity and detonated itself at exactly the right moment to inflict fatal damage. What Cochrane couldn't yet understand was that he'd just witnessed the combat debut of technology that would fundamentally alter anti-aircraft warfare, a device so secret that its existence was classified higher than most battle plans. The Mark 32 proximity fuse, codenamed VT for variable time to disguise its actual operating principle, represented one of the 3 most closely guarded technological secrets of World War II. Alongside radar and the atomic bomb, it changed the mathematics of survival for aircraft operating against defended targets. For dive bombers like the Stukas, or any aircraft compelled to approach anti-aircraft batteries at predictable altitudes and speeds, the VT fuse transformed defensive fire from an acceptable risk into near-certain destruction. The Germans in early 1943 could not yet know that American and British engineers had miniaturized radar into an artillery shell, a system rugged enough to survive 20,000 G-forces and sophisticated enough to autonomously detect targets and detonate at the optimal instant. That it could be mass-produced by the tens of thousands daily represented an industrial achievement comparable to any undertaken during the war. To understand what the Germans faced, and why they never expected this technology to emerge as quickly as it did, requires understanding the anti-aircraft problem as it existed in 1942. The problem that had frustrated every military force since aircraft became relevant weapons. How do you hit a target moving in 3 dimensions at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour when your projectile takes seconds to reach the target's altitude? Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine relied on barrage fire, multiple guns firing into a predicted intercept zone, creating a cone of exploding shells through which enemy aircraft had to pass. The shells used mechanical time fuses, wound like watches, set before firing to detonate after a specific interval. Gunners used range-finding equipment, calculated the target's altitude, speed, and bearing, set the fuses accordingly, and fired. If calculations were correct, if the target maintained course and speed, if the fuse worked as designed, then the shell exploded near the aircraft. near being defined as within lethal fragment range, approximately 60 feet for a 5-inch shell. Anything beyond that distance and the burst was wasted ammunition. The mathematics were unforgiving. A bomber at 15,000 feet flying at 200 miles per hour covered approximately 300 feet per second. The time of flight for a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell to reach 15,000 feet approached 15 seconds. In those 15 seconds, the bomber travelled 4,500 feet, nearly a mile. Gunners had to predict not where the target was, but where it would be 15 seconds in the future. If the bomber executed evasive maneuvers, if it changed altitude or bearing or speed, the prediction became worthless. The shells exploded in the empty sky. The bomber continued unmolested. Anti-aircraft batteries expended thousands of rounds per kill, sometimes tens of thousands depending on target behavior and defensive tactics. The US Navy, in 1942, tracked anti-aircraft effectiveness carefully. Their statistics showed that mechanical time fuzes achieved approximately 500 rounds fired per aircraft destroyed under optimal conditions. When targets maneuvered, when lighting was poor, when battle damage degraded fire control equipment, that ratio climbed above 1,000 rounds per kill. Some engagements consumed all available ammunition without scoring any victories. The Japanese understood this. Their dive bomber doctrine emphasized the final approach, the moment when the aircraft committed to its attack dive and could no longer maneuver effectively. During that brief window, perhaps 10 to 15 seconds, anti-aircraft fire became genuinely dangerous because the target's path was predictable. Before and after that window, evasive action made mechanical time fuses largely ineffective. German tactical doctrine operated on similar principles. Their pilots knew that anti-aircraft fire posed risk primarily during straight and level flight or when locked into attack runs. The solution was simple: don't fly straight, don't maintain constant altitude. Keep the gunners guessing, force them to expend ammunition on empty sky. This tactical wisdom had been proven through years of combat experience. It worked against British anti-aircraft defences in the Battle of Britain. It worked against Soviet anti-aircraft concentrations on the Eastern Front. It worked against American anti-aircraft batteries in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Pilots who maintained situational awareness, who didn't become target fixated, who remembered to jinx and weave after bomb release, survived at rates that made dive bombing and ground attack viable missions. Then Lieutenant Cochrane's gun battery destroyed a maneuvering VAL at 3 miles range without calculating deflection or predicting the target's exact future position. The proximity sensing fuse had done its work. What had happened inside that Mark 32 fuse during its 15-second flight toward the target represented engineering at the bleeding edge of what 1940s technology could achieve. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, not a simple device. A system sophisticated enough to broadcast radio waves, detect their reflection off nearby objects, measure the frequency shift caused by relative motion, and trigger detonation when that frequency shift indicated target proximity matching preset parameters. All of this functionality had to fit inside a cylindrical housing 3.5 inches in diameter and 8 inches long. The housing also contained the battery that powered the system, the safety mechanisms that prevented premature detonation, the firing circuit that ignited the explosive charge, and the mechanical components that armed the fuse only after the shell had travelled a safe distance from the launching ship. The vacuum tubes that made this possible were miracles of miniaturization. Sylvania Corporation had developed rugged pentodes specifically for this application, tubes that could survive 20,000 G-forces and continue functioning. Standard vacuum tubes of the era would shatter instantly under such acceleration. These specialized tubes featured reinforced internal structures, carefully selected materials, and manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The transmitter operated at a frequency of approximately 180 MHz, well into what would later be called the VHF band. The signal radiated outward from the shell in all directions. When that signal encountered a conductive object, an aircraft primarily, the metal skin reflected the radio waves back toward the shell. The receiver picked up these reflections. As the shell approached the target, the reflected signal grew stronger. The fuse measured this signal strength continuously. When strength exceeded a predetermined threshold, indicating the target was within lethal fragment range, the firing circuit closed. A small explosive charge in the base of the fuse detonated. That charge set off the main bursting charge in the shell body. The projectile exploded, sending steel fragments outward at thousands of feet per second. The entire process, from signal detection to detonation, occurred in microseconds, faster than any mechanical system could function. Fast, enough that the shell exploded at optimum distance, even when both projectile and target were closing at combined speeds, exceeding 500 miles per hour. The British had conceived the theoretical principles in 1939. Researchers Samuel Curran, William Butemont, Edward Shire, and Amherst Thompson at the Telecommunications Research Establishment recognized that radar technology, still in its infancy, could potentially be miniaturized into a weapon fuse. They understood the tactical advantage such a device would provide. They also understood that making it work would require solving problems that seemed intractable. The primary obstacle was ruggedization. Radar sets in 1939 occupied entire rooms, required careful calibration, broke down frequently, and needed trained technicians for operation and repair. Shrinking that technology into something that could be fired from a gun seemed impossible. The British tried. They made progress. But by 1940, with the Battle of Britain consuming all available resources, they concluded that a working proximity fuse for artillery shells wouldn't be achievable during the war's timeframe. For bombs and rockets, perhaps, those experienced gentler acceleration. For artillery, the technical challenges were simply too severe. The British shared this conclusion with American researchers when the Tizard mission visited the United States in September 1940. The mission brought radar technology, jet engine designs, and numerous other innovations to America as part of the emerging cooperation between the two nations. Among the items discussed was the proximity fuse work. The Americans reached a different conclusion. They thought it might be possible, not easy, not quick, but possible if sufficient resources were committed. In June 1940, before the Tizard mission, the US had already begun preliminary research. The National Defense Research Committee established Section T at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. Physicist Merle Tuve led the effort. His mandate was straightforward: make a proximity fuse that works in artillery shells, figure out how. Report progress. Keep working until it works or until proven impossible. Tuve assembled a team: engineers, physicists, electronics specialists, munitions experts. They started with basic questions. Could vacuum tubes survive gunfire? What radio frequency would work best? How much power was needed? How would the fuse distinguish between targets and ground clutter? How could it be manufactured in quantity? Each question spawned dozens more. The work proceeded in parallel tracks. Some researchers focused on tube design. Others worked on transmitter circuits. Others handled receiver sensitivity. Others designed battery systems. Others developed safety mechanisms. Others figured out how to make the whole assembly small enough and light enough to fit inside a shell without significantly degrading its ballistic properties. The vacuum tube problem consumed enormous effort. Standard tubes used thin glass envelopes that shattered under even minor impact. The gun launch environment subjected everything inside the shell to acceleration that could reach 20,000 times Earth's gravity. That force would pulverize ordinary tubes. The filaments would snap. The internal structures would collapse. The glass would crack. Sylvania's solution involved multiple innovations: thicker glass, reinforced filament supports, internal bracing, careful selection of materials with matching thermal expansion coefficients, manufacturing processes that eliminate microscopic flaws, quality control that rejected any tube showing even tiny defects. Even with all these improvements, early tubes failed at high rates. The team tested them on special devices that simulated gun launch conditions: centrifuges, air guns, Actual gun firings using instrumented test shells. Failure after failure. Adjustments. More tests. More failures. Gradual improvement. By mid-1941, Sylvania could produce tubes that survived launch reliably. Not every tube, maybe 70%, but that was enough to continue development. The other 30% would be addressed through improved manufacturing and stricter quality control. The transmitter and receiver circuits presented their own challenges. The system needed enough power to detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 feet, but not so much power that the fuze's battery depleted before the shell reached the target. The radio frequency had to be high enough for good target discrimination, but not so high that atmospheric absorption degraded the signal. Engineers settled on 180 MHz as optimal for 5-inch shells. This frequency provided good range, adequate resolution, and could be generated by available tube technology. The transmitter circuit was remarkably simple by later standards, basic oscillator design. But making it reliable, making it consistent, making it manufacturable, required endless iteration. The receiver had to be sensitive enough to detect weak reflections from distant targets, but immune to interference from the gun's muzzle blast, from nearby shell bursts, from the intense radio frequency environment of a naval battle. The design incorporated automatic gain control, frequency filtering, and careful shielding. The battery system was perhaps the most elegant solution. The fuse required approximately 5 watts of power for 15 seconds of operation. Standard batteries of that era couldn't deliver sufficient power in such a small package while withstanding launch G-forces. The team developed a specialized design using reserve activation. The battery existed in an inert state until firing. The launch acceleration forced an electrolyte ampule to break, activating the battery. Within milliseconds, the battery reached full output. It remained functional for approximately 30 seconds, more than enough for any realistic engagement. This approach eliminated shelf life concerns. The fuse could be stored for years without battery degradation because the battery didn't activate until firing. It also provided inherent safety. An unfired fuse couldn't accidentally detonate because the battery was inert. Safety mechanisms layered multiple independent systems. The fuse wouldn't arm until the shell had traveled at least 400 yards from the gun. This prevented premature detonation that could endanger the launching ship or nearby vessels. The arming system used centrifugal force from the shell's spin to release mechanical locks. The shell had to rotate at a minimum speed for a minimum duration before the fuse became active. Even after arming, the fuse contained a self-destruct mechanism. If the target detection circuit didn't trigger within 30 seconds, the fuse automatically detonated the shell. This prevented duds from falling into enemy hands where they might be recovered and reverse-engineered. Every Mark 32 fuse that left the gun either exploded near a target or exploded in mid-air. None survived intact to the ground. This self-destruct feature was absolutely critical to the weapon's deployment strategy. The US Navy initially restricted VT fuses to overwater use only. The risk of a dud landing where enemy forces could recover it seemed unacceptable. If the Germans or Japanese obtained an intact proximity fuse, if they reverse-engineered the technology, if they developed countermeasures or their own proximity fuses, the Allied advantage would evaporate. By limiting use to naval engagements, by requiring that all shells detonate over deep ocean, the Navy minimized this risk. Any fuse that malfunctioned would sink into water too deep for recovery. Even if the enemy suspected proximity fuzzes existed, they couldn't confirm it or study the technology without physical examples. The Germans did suspect. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with VT-fused anti-aircraft fire reported unusual burst patterns, shells that seemed to track targets, that exploded without visible explanation at ranges where mechanical time fuses shouldn't detonate. Intelligence analysts noted these reports. They speculated about possible causes: remote control detonation by the firing ship, optical sensors that detected target shadows, some unknown principle. What they didn't immediately grasp was that the Americans had miniaturized radar into artillery shells. That leap seemed too large. German radar research in 1942 focused on ground-based systems for air defense and fire control. The idea of putting similar technology into a 3-inch diameter container that could survive being shot from a gun didn't appear on their research priority lists. The Germans had explored proximity fuse development before the war. Research at Rheinmetall-Borsig investigated electrostatic principles. Other programs examined acoustic detonation triggered by engine noise. These projects showed promise in laboratory testing, but in mid-1940, Hitler issued orders cancelling military research programs that couldn't produce results within 6 months. The proximity fuse programs were terminated. Resources shifted to projects closer to deployment. This decision would prove strategically catastrophic. By the time German researchers returned to proximity fuse development in late 1944, after it became obvious the Allies possessed such technology, the war situation made mass production impossible. German prototypes never reached operational service. Meanwhile, American production ramped up through 1942 and 43. The first Mark 32 fuses came off Crosley Corporation's production line in September 1942. Initial output was slow, 500 units per day. Quality problems plagued early manufacturing. Fuses that worked in laboratory testing failed after mass production. Engineers traced failures to minute variations in component specifications, to assembly sequence errors, to environmental factors in factories. By late 1943, production stabilized at 40,000 units daily. 5 companies participated: Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Each operated multiple production lines. Components came from 87 different suppliers using 110 factories. The supply chain required careful coordination. A failure at any point could halt final assembly. Quality control remained absolutely critical. Every fuse underwent multiple tests before acceptance. Electrical checks verified the transmitter and receiver functioned correctly. Mechanical tests ensured proper arming sequences. Environmental tests confirmed operation across temperature ranges from -50 to +100 degrees Fahrenheit. Centrifuge tests simulated launch G-forces. Fuses that failed any test were rejected. The rejection rate exceeded 10% initially. Some batches showed 30% failure rates. Engineers worked with factory supervisors to identify causes. Process improvements gradually reduced rejection rates below 5% by mid-1944. The first combat use in January 1943 validated years of research and development. Helena's success off Guadalcanal proved the concept worked under real combat conditions. But one success didn't provide statistical significance. The Navy needed data. They needed to know how much improvement the VT fuse actually provided compared to mechanical time fuses. Throughout 1943, the Pacific Fleet accumulated combat results. In that year, naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds. 25% used VT fuses. Those VT-fused rounds accounted for 51% of kills. The improvement was undeniable. Mechanical time fuses required an average of 508 rounds per kill. VT fuses averaged 155 rounds per kill, a 3-to-1 improvement in efficiency. These numbers understated the true tactical advantage. The VT fuse's real value wasn't just reducing ammunition expenditure, it was eliminating the targeting problem. Gunners no longer needed to predict future target positions accurately. They just needed to get shells into the general vicinity. The fuses handled the rest. This psychological impact on gun crews proved significant. Previously, anti-aircraft duty had been frustrating. Crews fired hundreds of rounds during an attack and often scored no hits. They watched targets maneuver away from predicted intercept zones. They felt helpless despite following procedures correctly. The VT fuse changed that dynamic. Now they saw results. Targets exploded. The aircraft fell. Their efforts produced visible, immediate effects. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact was opposite and equally significant. They'd learned through experience that anti-aircraft fire was survivable if you didn't fly straight. Maneuver aggressively, and the shells exploded behind you or ahead of you, but rarely close enough to kill. That confidence eroded through 1943 as more aircraft encountered VT-fused defensive fire. Survivors reported that evasive action no longer prevented hits. Shells seemed to follow them, to track them, to know where they were, regardless of how violently they maneuvered. The technical reality was simpler. The shells didn't track anything. They just exploded when they detected proximity. But from the pilot's perspective, trapped in a cockpit with limited visibility, while anti-aircraft bursts bracketed his aircraft with unnatural accuracy, the effect seemed like guided ammunition. This demoralization factor appeared in post-war interrogations of Japanese aviators. Multiple pilots identified American anti-aircraft technology as among the most psychologically devastating aspects of the war. Not because it was invincible. They still achieved successful attacks against heavily defended targets, but because it removed the margin of safety that aggressive maneuvering had previously provided. Every approach to an American ship now carried increased risk that no amount of skill could fully mitigate. The Germans would face a similar realization once VT fuses deployed against them, but in early 1943, the European and Mediterranean theaters hadn't yet received the new ammunition. Production was limited. The Pacific had priority due to the constant air threat against naval forces operating far from friendly bases. Europe would have to wait. The technical development of the VT fuse continued even as production ramped up. The Mark 32 design for 5-inch shells was just the beginning. The Army wanted fuses for 90mm anti-aircraft guns. The British needed fuzes adapted to their 3.7-inch anti-aircraft ammunition. Both services wanted fuzes for larger calibers, 105mm, 120mm. Even 155mm field artillery pieces. Each caliber required redesign. The physics changed with shell size. Larger shells experienced lower G-forces during launch but travelled at different velocities. The radio frequency that worked optimally for 5-inch shells might not be ideal for 90mm projectiles. Battery power requirements varied. Fuse size constraints differed. The 90mm adaptation became the Army's priority. The 90mm gun M1A1 was America's primary heavy anti-aircraft weapon for ground-based air defense. It had replaced the older 3-inch gun starting in 1941. The 90mm could fire shells to a maximum altitude of 43,500 feet, with an effective fire control altitude of 30,000 feet. This range exceeded what most German aircraft could reach, but bombers flying at extreme altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire fell within the 90mm engagement envelope. The gun fired a projectile weighing approximately 23 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,700 feet per second. The barrel length was 15 feet, giving it a 50 caliber length. The weapon was mounted on a mobile carriage that allowed rapid deployment and repositioning. 4 guns typically operated together as a battery, controlled by centralized fire direction using radar and mechanical computers. The fire control system for 90mm batteries represented sophisticated technology even before VT fuses entered the picture. Starting in 1941, batteries used the SCR-268 radar for ranging and tracking. This radar wasn't accurate enough to aim guns directly, but provided continuous range information throughout the engagement. The M7 or M9 director processed radar data and generated firing solutions. Gun crews received continuous updates on azimuth, elevation, and fuse settings. At night, searchlights slaved to the radar illuminated targets once they were within visual range. The searchlight beam width was set so targets would be somewhere in the cone when the light activated. Once illuminated, optical tracking supplemented radar data. The system worked but suffered from the fundamental limitation of mechanical time fuzzes. All the radar accuracy and fire control sophistication in the world couldn't compensate for targets that maneuvered unpredictably. The calculated intercept point assumed constant target motion. When bombers jinked or changed altitude, the intercept calculation became invalid. Shells exploded where the bomber would have been if it hadn't maneuvered. Section T at Applied Physics Laboratory began adapting the proximity fuse for 90mm shells in mid-1942. The team faced familiar challenges and some new ones. The 90mm shell was larger than 5-inch naval ammunition, providing more space for fuse components. But it also experienced different ballistic characteristics. The shell's longer time of flight meant the fuse needed to remain powered longer. The higher maximum altitude meant it had to function reliably in thinner atmosphere at lower temperatures. Testing proceeded through late 1942 and into 1943. By mid-1943, the Army had VT fuses ready for 90mm guns, but deployment was restricted. The fuses could not be used over land where duds might fall into German hands. This restriction eliminated the primary use case. Ground-based anti-aircraft batteries defending against German bombers over Allied territory couldn't employ the new technology because of security concerns. The restriction frustrated Army commanders who saw VT fuzes as potentially war-winning technology for air defense. They argued that proper self-destruct mechanisms would prevent intact fuzes from being recovered. They pointed out that German air attacks were causing significant casualties that VT fuses could reduce. The counter-argument focused on intelligence security. If even one fuse failed to self-destruct, if the Germans recovered it and reverse-engineered the technology, the strategic advantage would be lost. This stalemate persisted through most of 1944. VT fuses for Army artillery sat in depots, manufactured but unused, while the Navy continued employing them extensively in the Pacific. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, not from changing security policies, but from a change in the threat. If you're finding value in this detailed research, your like, subscribe, and share make a real difference. It takes minimal effort but helps us dedicate more time to uncovering these hidden stories. On June 6, 1944, a week after the Normandy invasion, Germany launched a new terror weapon against London, the Von flying bomb, Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1. An unmanned, jet-powered cruise missile carrying an 1,800-pound warhead. The Von was launched from fixed ramps in occupied France, flew at low altitude at approximately 400 miles per hour, and had a range of about 150 miles. From June through August, the Germans launched 9,300 V1s at London, an average of 120 per day. The attacks killed thousands of civilians and caused widespread destruction. The psychological impact was severe. Unlike bombers that could be shot down or deterred, the V1s were relentless and impersonal. They arrived day and night, their distinctive pulse jet engine creating a buzzing sound that gave them the nickname Buzz Bomb. British defences struggled. Fighter aircraft could intercept V1s, but the missiles flew fast enough and low enough that interceptions were difficult and dangerous. Some RAF pilots developed techniques of flying alongside V1s and using their wingtip to flip the missile's gyroscope, causing it to crash. This required extraordinary skill and nerves. Anti-aircraft guns had better success rates, but the Von's small size and high speed made it a challenging target for conventional mechanical time fuses. Section T modified proximity fuses specifically for the Von threat, adapting them for both British 3.7-inch and American 90mm anti-aircraft shells. The modifications addressed the unique characteristics of the target. The Von's metal skin provided a good radar return. Its predictable flight path, locked in by its gyroscopic autopilot, made it an ideal target for proximity fusing. The missile couldn't maneuver away from approaching shells. In mid-July 1944, approximately 500 guns equipped with VT fuzzes deployed to installations along the English Channel. The results were immediate and dramatic. In June, before VT fuzzes, anti-aircraft guns destroyed 17% of incoming V1s. By late August, with VT fuzzes deployed, the destruction rate reached 79%. Some batteries reported even higher success rates, destroying 94% of V1s they engaged in certain weeks. Winston Churchill later acknowledged that the VT fuses proved potent against the small unmanned aircraft with which we were assailed in 1944. The proximity fuse had saved London from devastation that conventional defences couldn't prevent. The Vosne campaign also eliminated security concerns about using VT fuses over land. The missiles fell on British territory. If a VT-fused shell failed to detonate, it would land in Allied-controlled areas where recovery teams could secure it. More importantly, the self-destruct mechanisms proved reliable. Analysis of Vosne attack zones found no intact proximity fuses, despite thousands being fired. This operational validation opened the door for Army use of VT fuses against aircraft targets over land. But an even more dramatic authorization was coming, one that would demonstrate the fuse's effectiveness against massed German ground forces in conditions where its tactical advantages were overwhelming. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, punched through American lines along an 85-mile front. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units were overrun or surrounded. German armoured columns drove deep into Allied territory, aiming to capture Antwerp and split the Allied armies. The weather was atrocious. Heavy snow and fog grounded Allied air power. The Germans had planned their offensive to exploit these conditions, knowing that without air support, American ground forces would be vulnerable to massed armour and infantry attacks. German commanders felt safe from artillery as well, assuming the bad weather would prevent accurate fire direction. They were wrong. General Dwight Eisenhower had been demanding authorization to use VT fuses in ground combat for months. The Pentagon had resisted, still worried about security implications. But Eisenhower's arguments were compelling. VT fuses set to detonate as air bursts would devastate infantry caught in the open. The proximity principle that worked against aircraft would work against ground targets. Instead of detecting metal aircraft, the fuse would detect the ground itself and detonate at a preset altitude, showering the area with fragments. On December 18, 1944, just 2 days after the German offensive began, the prohibition on land use of VT fuses was lifted. Massive stockpiles of VT-fused ammunition, manufactured but restricted for months, suddenly became available for combat use. Artillery batteries across the front received the shells and began firing them immediately. The effect was catastrophic for German forces. Traditional artillery doctrine against infantry in the open relied on impact fuses or mechanical time fuses set to detonate on contact with the ground. This created a beaten zone where fragments spread outward from impact points. Soldiers in trenches, behind cover, or prone on the ground had significant protection. The fragments flew horizontally or at low angles. Digging in provided effective defense. VT fuses eliminated this protection. The shells detonated 20 to 50 feet above ground level, depending on how the fuse was set. From that height, fragments rained down at steep angles. Trenches provided no shelter. Neither was prone. The fragments came from above, creating a cone of death that covered far larger areas than ground-burst shells. A single VT-fused shell had a lethal fragment area of approximately 3,000 square feet. A conventional shell with impact fuse had lethal coverage of 60 square feet. General George Patton wrote to the War Department describing the new shell's effectiveness. "We caught a German battalion trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. He noted that the new shell with the funny fuse is devastating and suggested, when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. Experienced terror for which no training had prepared them. The shells exploded overhead without warning. There was no impact to give a fractional second warning. The burst occurred in mid-air, and fragments arrived instantly from above. Standard defensive procedures, taking cover and waiting for the barrage to pass, didn't work. A cover that protected against ground bursts was useless against air bursts. The only defense was deep bunkers or substantial overhead protection, neither of which was available during mobile operations. Post-war interrogation of German prisoners revealed that the attacks were quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Some units experienced what amounted to mutiny, with soldiers refusing orders to advance or move through areas under VT fuse fire. Officers reported that veterans who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet artillery barrages and tank attacks without breaking, became psychologically shattered by exposure to VT-fused American artillery. The tactical impact extended beyond casualties. German commanders planning the Ardennes offensive had assumed bad weather would protect them from American artillery because forward observers couldn't direct fire accurately. They felt safe from timed fire because they believed weather would prevent accurate observation. This assumption was correct for traditional time-fused shells, which required precise range and altitude data. But VT fuses didn't need precise data. The fuse automatically adjusted to local ground elevation. American artillery batteries could fire into areas where German forces were suspected without detailed targeting information. The shells would detonate at the preset height above whatever terrain they encountered. Against massed formations moving through the Ardennes, this area suppression capability was devastating. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated VT fuse effectiveness in ground combat, but the technology's application against aircraft remained the original design purpose. Through 1944 and 45, as VT fuses became more widely available, American anti-aircraft defenses achieved kill ratios that German and Japanese air forces simply couldn't sustain. The Germans never developed effective countermeasures. They attempted to jam the fuse's radio frequency, but the fuses operated on frequencies difficult to jam with available technology. They tried coating aircraft with radar-absorbent materials, but wartime Germany lacked the industrial capacity to retrofit existing aircraft or incorporate such materials into new production. They accelerated their own proximity fuse research, but by the time German engineers had working prototypes in early 1945, the war situation made mass production impossible. What the Germans faced wasn't just a technological challenge, it was a systemic problem created by earlier strategic decisions. The 1940 order to cancel research programs that couldn't produce results within 6 months had terminated German proximity fuse development precisely when it was most needed. By the time this error became apparent, Germany's industrial capacity was degraded by strategic bombing and resource shortages. Catching up to Allied technology became impossible. The Americans, meanwhile, had committed resources to proximity fuse development when it seemed like a long shot. They'd maintained the program through years of technical difficulties and uncertain results. They'd solved problems that the British, with their head start, had concluded were unsolvable. They'd scaled production to industrial levels that allowed tens of thousands of fuses to be manufactured daily. This sustained commitment, this willingness to fund research without guaranteed outcomes, created a technological advantage that proved decisive in multiple campaigns. Let's address the aircraft that became symbolic of German air power and how VT fuses affected their operations. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, that distinctive dive bomber with inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear, had terrorized ground targets from Poland to France to North Africa. The Stuka operated with considerable success in close air support and anti-shipping roles at the outbreak of World War II. But the Stuka had always been vulnerable to determined fighter opposition. The Battle of Britain proved for the first time that the Junkers Ju-87 was vulnerable in hostile skies against well-organized and determined fighter opposition. The Stuka was slow and possessed inadequate defenses and could not be effectively protected by fighters because of its low speed and the very low altitudes at which it ended its dive bomb attacks. On August 18, 1940, known as the hardest day because both sides suffered heavy losses, the Stuka was withdrawn after 16 were destroyed and many others damaged. According to German records, 59 Stukas had been destroyed and 33 damaged to varying degrees in 6 weeks of operations over Britain. The Stuka's service ceiling varied by model. The Ju-87 Bone had a service ceiling of 8,000 meters, approximately 26,247 feet. Earlier, models had even lower ceilings, around 13,500 feet. These altitudes kept the Stuka well below the 30,000-foot engagement envelope that VT-fused 90mm batteries could cover, but more critically, the Stuka's operational profile made it exceptionally vulnerable to proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Dive bombers by nature had to approach targets in predictable patterns. Stukas would typically begin their dive at around 13,000 feet, diving at a 90-degree vertical angle. The Stuka maintained a speed between 340 and 370 miles per hour during the dive, by extending dive brakes to stabilize the aircraft and increase pilot accuracy. After releasing the bomb, the automatic pull-up system would engage around 450 meters, putting the crew through 6GS, which often caused pilots to black out or temporarily lose vision. This entire sequence, from the moment the Stuka committed to its dive until it recovered at low altitude, took approximately 15 to 20 seconds. During that time, the aircraft followed a ballistic path with minimal ability to maneuver. Any Stuka approaching a target defended by VT-fused anti-aircraft batteries entered a kill zone where the shells didn't need to predict its exact position. They just needed to get close enough for the fuse to detect the aircraft and detonate. The Germans recognized this vulnerability. By late 1944, Stuka operations against well-defended targets had essentially ceased. The aircraft was relegated to missions on the Eastern Front, where Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, while numerous, lacked the sophistication of American radar-directed batteries with VT fuses. Even there, losses mounted steadily. But the title's reference to Stukas at 30,000 feet captures a broader truth about German aviation in the face of VT-fused defenses. It wasn't just the literal Stuka that suffered. Any German aircraft operating within the engagement envelope of VT-equipped anti-aircraft batteries faced dramatically increased danger. High-altitude bombers, which the Germans deployed in limited numbers, found that altitude alone no longer provided protection. Consider the tactical situation facing German bomber crews attacking Allied positions in late 1944 and early 1945. Traditional doctrine called for bombers to approach at maximum altitude, above effective anti-aircraft range, or to make low-level attacks that minimized exposure time. The middle altitudes, between 10,000 and 25,000 feet, were considered most dangerous because they fell within optimal anti-aircraft engagement parameters. VT fuses extended the dangerous zone and made it far more lethal. A bomber at 20,000 feet was well within 90mm range. With mechanical time fuses, that bomber could survive if it maneuvered or if the gunner's calculations were even slightly off. With VT fuses, the bomber had to avoid not just direct hits but any shell that passed within 100 feet. The shells would find it. German intelligence eventually identified proximity fuses as a critical Allied technology. Interrogation of captured American personnel, analysis of recovered shell fragments, and reports from pilots who survived encounters with VT-fused defenses all pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans had developed radio-detonated fuses that eliminated the need for precise range calculation. What German intelligence couldn't determine initially was how the fuses worked. The most popular theory was that they were command-detonated by radio signals from the firing battery. This theory seemed logical. The battery tracked the target with radar, calculated intercept parameters, and transmitted a detonation signal when the shell reached the correct position. This interpretation suggested potential countermeasures: radio jamming, directional receivers to detect the command signals, tactics to break radar lock. None of these countermeasures worked because the theory was wrong. The fuses were autonomous. They didn't receive signals from the ground. They generated their own signals, detected their own targets, and made their own detonation decisions. Jamming was ineffective because you couldn't jam a receiver that was listening for its own transmitter's reflections. Breaking radar lock didn't matter because the fuse's radar was independent of the fire control radar. By the time German engineers figured this out, through analysis of shell fragments and technical intelligence, developing countermeasures was beyond German industrial capacity. The solution would have required either widespread use of radar-absorbent coatings on aircraft or development of Germany's own proximity fuses. Neither was feasible given the strategic situation in 1945. The cumulative effect of VT fuses on German air operations is difficult to quantify precisely because so many factors influenced combat outcomes. Aircraft were lost to fighters, to conventional anti-aircraft fire, to mechanical failures, to pilot error. Separating the specific contribution of VT fuses from other variables requires detailed analysis of engagement data that may not exist in complete form. What can be documented is that American anti-aircraft effectiveness improved dramatically once VT fuses deployed widely. Analysis of 278 aircraft shot down by VT-fused projectiles between October 1944 and August 1945 indicates that only 46 of these would have been destroyed if time-fused projectiles had been employed. This 6-to-1 ratio represented the minimum improvement, assuming 70% fuse reliability. With more conservative reliability assumptions around 50%, the effectiveness ratio was closer to 4-to-1. 4-to-1 improvement meant that anti-aircraft batteries achieved with 100 rounds what previously required 400. This translated to sustained higher rates of fire over longer engagements, less ammunition consumption, faster engagement of multiple targets, and improved crew morale from visible success. For German aircrew, these statistics represented a death spiral. As VT fuses became more common, as more Allied anti-aircraft batteries received the new ammunition, as doctrine evolved to maximize the fuse's advantages, the survival rate for German aircraft declined. Missions that had been dangerous became nearly suicidal. Formations suffered unsustainable attrition rates. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable given Germany's degraded training program, were killed at accelerating rates. The psychological impact mirrored what Japanese pilots had experienced in the Pacific. German airmen who survived multiple missions against VT-fused defenses described the same sense of helplessness. Traditional evasive tactics didn't work. The shells followed them, or seemed to. There was no margin for error, no protective buffer that skill and experience could provide. Some German pilots reported that the fear of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire exceeded their fear of Allied fighters. Against fighters, you could maneuver, you could fight back, you could employ tactics that might let you survive even when outnumbered. Against VT fuses, you just had to fly through the barrage and hope none of the shells came close enough. There was nothing else you could do. This demoralization extended to the broader Luftwaffe. By early 1945, German air forces had largely ceded daylight air superiority over Western Europe. Some historians attribute this to fuel shortages, to pilot quality degradation, to the overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters. All these factors contributed, but the knowledge that approaching Allied-controlled territory meant facing VT-fused anti-aircraft defenses in addition to fighters, radar-directed night fighters, and every other Allied advantage, made missions that were already nearly impossible completely unviable. The technical evolution of the VT fuse continued through the war's end. Engineers developed versions for 105mm howitzer shells, for 155mm artillery, for rockets and bombs. Each application required adaptations of the basic principle. Bombs fell at different velocities than gun-fired shells and experienced different G-forces. Rockets had their own unique characteristics. The fuse design had to accommodate these variations while maintaining reliability. The manufacturing infrastructure expanded continuously, with production nearly doubling by war's end. The supply chain's complexity meant disruption at any supplier could cascade through the entire system. The program represented industrial mobilization at its finest. From initial concept in 1940 to mass production by 1943, required solving unprecedented technical challenges, creating entirely new manufacturing processes, and training thousands of workers in specialized skills, all while maintaining security so strict that most workers didn't know what they were building. The security measures were extraordinary. Workers assembled components without understanding the complete system. Different factories produced different parts. Final assembly occurred at secure facilities with restricted access. The fuses were shipped in unmarked containers. Units receiving them got minimal information. Don't discuss them. Don't let them fall into enemy hands. Fire them as directed. This compartmentalization worked. Despite VT fuzes being used in thousands of engagements across multiple theaters, despite tens of thousands being manufactured monthly, the technology remained secret until well after the war. German intelligence never obtained complete technical information. The Japanese similarly failed to recover intact fuses that would have allowed reverse engineering. The post-war assessment of the VT fuse's impact placed it among the most significant technical achievements of the war. General Sam Phillips stated that, had the Germans perfected an effective proximity fuse well before the war ended, the outcome of the war could significantly have been affected. The proximity fuse was considered one of the most important technological innovations of World War II, ranking alongside radar and the atomic bomb in strategic significance. The fuse's influence extended beyond immediate military applications. The principles it demonstrated, miniaturized radar, autonomous targeting, mechanical electronic integration, informed post-war weapons development. The proximity fuse was a direct ancestor of guided missiles. The radio frequency techniques developed for the VT fuse contributed to post-war radar evolution. The manufacturing methods pioneered for mass production of complex electronic systems established patterns that shaped modern defense manufacturing. The Korean War saw continued use of VT fuses. With an altitude capability of 30,000 feet and a range of 14 miles, the 90mm gun was a proven performer that scored numerous kills when linked to fire control computers and fitted with VT proximity fuzzes. The Cold War air defense systems that protected American cities from 1950 through the late 50s relied on VT-fused 90mm and 120mm guns before surface-to-air missiles replaced them. But the German experience in World War II remained the definitive demonstration of what happened when an air force encountered technology it couldn't counter. The Luftwaffe in 1944 and 45 faced Allied air supremacy created by multiple factors: numerical superiority, better aircraft, more experienced pilots in the latter stages, overwhelming industrial capacity, fuel shortages that limited German operations. And, crucially, defensive technologies like VT fuses that made surviving missions against Allied targets exponentially more difficult. The individual stories behind the statistics reveal the human dimension of technological warfare. Consider Lieutenant Hans Kramer, a fictional composite representing real Luftwaffe pilots flying missions in late 1944. Kramer had survived 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front. He'd flown hundreds of missions, accumulated dozens of confirmed victories against Soviet aircraft, and earned decorations for his skill and courage. In December 1944, his unit transferred to the Western Front to support the Ardennes offensive. Kramer's first mission against American positions shocked him. His formation of 6 aircraft approached the target area at 18,000 feet. American radar detected them 30 miles out. 90mm batteries tracked them continuously. As they reached weapons range, the anti-aircraft fire began. What Kramer experienced wasn't the barrage fire he'd encountered in the East. Soviet anti-aircraft could be intense, but it was predictable. Watch for muzzle flashes, count seconds, maneuver before the shells reach your altitude. It had worked for 2 years. Against American VT-fused batteries, it didn't work at all. The shells exploded around his formation with uncanny precision. Not where they had been, where they were. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, black bursts surrounded them. His wingman disappeared in an explosion that seemed to track him through an evasive roll. Another aircraft took fragments, through the engine and trailed smoke as the pilot tried desperately to reach friendly lines. Kramer's aircraft shuddered as fragments punctured the left wing. Not a catastrophic hit, but enough to damage the aileron and make the aircraft difficult to control. He aborted the mission and turned for home. Of the 6 aircraft that began the mission, 3 returned. 50% losses on a single sortie, unsustainable by any measure. The debriefing officer asked what went wrong. Kramer couldn't articulate it clearly. The anti-aircraft fire was different. More accurate, more deadly, like the shells knew where they were. The intelligence officer noted this in his report. Similar descriptions were coming from other pilots. The Americans had something new. Over the next weeks, as more missions were flown, as more aircraft were lost, the pattern became clear. American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased dramatically. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were being killed at rates that exceeded losses from fighter combat. Formation tactics that had worked for years were suddenly inadequate. German tactical doctrine evolved in response, but the adaptations were mostly defensive. Avoid heavily defended targets. Approach at extreme low altitude where radar tracking was difficult. Strike at night when anti-aircraft batteries had reduced effectiveness. These tactics reduced losses, but also reduced mission effectiveness. An air force flying at treetop level to avoid anti-aircraft fire couldn't effectively engage targets that required medium-altitude attacks. The broader strategic implications were profound. The VT fuse contributed to Allied air supremacy not just by shooting down German aircraft, but by restricting where and how German aircraft could operate. Missions became so dangerous that fuel, which was already scarce, couldn't be justified for anything but the most critical operations. Pilot training, already degraded by fuel shortages and time pressures, suffered further because training missions exposed aircraft to the same lethal defenses that made combat missions so costly. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively a spent force in the West. Individual aircraft still flew missions. There were still skilled pilots, but sustained operations at meaningful scale had become impossible. The combination of Allied fighters, superior numbers, and VT-fused anti-aircraft defenses created an environment where German aircraft couldn't survive in sufficient numbers to affect the war's outcome. The Pacific Theater told a similar story. Japanese forces faced VT fuses earlier and over a longer period. The statistical evidence from Pacific operations provided the data that validated the technology's effectiveness and justified its expansion to other theaters. For the remainder of 1943, the United States Navy in the Pacific credited VT-fused anti-aircraft fire with more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed, despite VT fuses being used in only a fraction of rounds fired. The kamikaze attacks of 1945 demonstrated both the fuse's capabilities and its limitations. Kamikaze aircraft dove directly at their targets with no intention of survival. This made them predictable targets in some ways. Their flight path was essentially a straight line from initial detection to impact point. VT-fused batteries could engage them effectively throughout their approach. But kamikazes also closed so quickly that there was limited time for multiple engagements. A conventional bombing attack might involve several minutes of tracking and multiple firing opportunities. A kamikaze attack compressed everything into 30 seconds or less. Gunners had to hit with the first or second salvo because there might not be a third opportunity. Statistics from October 1944 through January 1945 showed that VT fuses required significantly fewer rounds per kill against kamikazes than conventional attacks. The straight-line approach made them ideal targets for proximity fusing, but the absolute number of rounds required was still significant because defensive fire had to stop every kamikaze before it reached the target. The casualty statistics from Okinawa in 1945 showed what happened when determined attacks overwhelmed defenses. At Okinawa alone, the Navy lost 21 ships sunk and 66 damaged, 2/3 of them still being repaired when the war ended. VT fuses helped reduce these losses but couldn't prevent them entirely. The kamikaze tactic, for all its horror, acknowledged the reality that conventional attacks against VT-fused defenses had become nearly impossible. The war ended before the full implications of VT-fused technology could be explored. German researchers in early 1945 were working on their own proximity fuse designs, but none reached production. By 1945, German prototypes were ready but came too late. The collapse of German industry and the chaotic final months of the war prevented any operational deployment. Japanese engineers similarly attempted to develop proximity fuzzes, but lacked the industrial capacity and technical foundation. Their radar technology lagged behind Allied developments. The specialized vacuum tubes required for proximity fusing were beyond Japanese manufacturing capabilities given wartime resource constraints. Even if they'd had the technical knowledge, which captured documents suggest they partially reconstructed from shell fragment analysis, they couldn't have produced the fuses in meaningful quantities. The post-war world inherited a technology that had proven decisive but was already becoming obsolete. The VT fuse represented the pinnacle of mechanical electronic integration for its era, but jet aircraft flying at 600 miles per hour and supersonic missiles rendered anti-aircraft guns increasingly marginal regardless of how sophisticated their imminent fuses were. The future belonged to surface-to-air missiles, which were essentially proximity-fused rockets with terminal guidance systems. The principle developed for the VT fuse lives on in modern weapons systems, including the Phoenix AIM-54 air-to-air missile, the standard missile SM-1 and SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, and the Patriot surface-to-air missile. Every guided munition that uses radar or laser proximity detection for terminal guidance traces its intellectual lineage to the VT fuse, developed under wartime pressure by Section T at Applied Physics Laboratory. The engineers and scientists who created the VT fuse were largely unknown outside classified circles. Merle Tuve, who led the program, returned to academic research after the war. The Sylvania engineers who developed rugged vacuum tubes went on to careers in the emerging electronics industry, often without being able to discuss their wartime contributions due to ongoing security restrictions. The factory workers who assembled fuses by the thousands had no idea their work had helped win the war until declassification decades later. This anonymity was intentional. The VT fuse's effectiveness depended on the enemy not understanding how it worked or being able to develop countermeasures. Secrecy had to be maintained even after the war ended, because the technology would remain militarily significant through the Cold War. The engineers accepted this. Their reward was knowing they'd solved problems others had considered impossible and created weapons that saved Allied lives by shortening the war. The German perspective on the VT fuse, assembled from post-war interrogations and captured documents, revealed a mixture of respect and frustration. German engineers who examined captured shell fragments in late 1944 and early 1945 recognized the sophistication of what they were seeing. Miniaturized radar in an artillery shell represented exactly the kind of elegant engineering solution that Germany had once excelled at producing. But by the time they understood what they faced, Germany's capacity to respond had been destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign had disrupted production. Resource shortages made advanced electronics manufacturing nearly impossible. The scientists and engineers who might have solved the problems were scattered, conscripted, or focused on other desperate measures to prop up collapsing defenses. The missed opportunity haunted some German scientists after the war. The research programs cancelled in 1940 might have produced working proximity fuzzes by 1942 if they'd been properly funded and prioritized. Germany had the technical expertise. Rheinmetall-Borsig's electrostatic fuse designs showed promise. But Hitler's directive to cancel projects that couldn't be delivered within 6 months had killed the programs at precisely the wrong moment. This decision exemplified a broader strategic failure. Germany entered the war believing existing technology, properly applied with superior tactics and operational skill, would deliver victory before Allied industrial capacity could be mobilized. They were partially correct. The Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1941 achieved stunning successes with conventional weapons and doctrine, but they fundamentally miscalculated how quickly America could develop and deploy new technologies. The VT fuse went from theoretical concept to mass production in less than 3 years. German planners, accustomed to their own bureaucratic processes and resource constraints, couldn't imagine such rapid development. They assumed proximity fuzzes were science fiction. By the time they realized their error, the technological gap had become unbridgeable. The lesson transcended specific technology. Wars are won not just by the weapons you have at the start, but by your capacity to develop new capabilities faster than your opponent can respond. The VT fuse demonstrated American advantages in research infrastructure, industrial capacity, and organizational ability to move from laboratory prototypes to battlefield deployment at unprecedented speed. For the Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war, the proximity fuse remained a source of bitter memory. In interviews decades later, veterans described the helplessness of flying against defenses that seemed to anticipate every move. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the tactical effectiveness. Knowing that skill and experience couldn't protect you, that the shells would find you regardless of how brilliantly you maneuvered, destroyed the confidence that combat aviators required to function effectively. The Americans had achieved what the Germans never expected. They'd made artillery shells intelligent. Not in the modern sense of artificial intelligence, but in the sense that each shell could make its own targeting decisions, could sense its environment, could determine the optimal moment for detonation without human intervention. This autonomy, this ability to delegate tactical decisions to weapons themselves, pointed toward the future of warfare. The VT fuse's legacy extends far beyond its World War II applications. It established principles that govern modern weapons design: sensors integrated with warheads, autonomous targeting decisions, fire and forget capabilities that free operators to engage multiple targets. Every smart munition in contemporary arsenals descends from the technology pioneered by the scientists at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under Merle Tuve's direction. The story of how Germans never expected VT fuses to make 90mm guns devastatingly effective against aircraft at extreme altitudes is ultimately a story about technological surprise, strategic miscalculation, and the decisive impact of industrial innovation. It's about British scientists identifying a principle, American engineers making it practical, Allied factories producing it at scale, and tactical implementations that changed the mathematics of survival for any aircraft operating within defended airspace. The proximity fuse didn't win the war alone, no single technology did, but it exemplified the systematic approach to military innovation that gave the Allies insurmountable advantages. Research programs sustained through years of uncertain results, industrial capacity committed to mass production before complete validation, security measures that protected technological advantages, tactical doctrine that evolved to maximize new capabilities, all coordinated across multiple services, multiple nations, and countless organizations working toward common purpose. Thank you for investing your time in this deep dive. If you found this valuable, a like and subscribe costs you nothing but means everything to us. Share this story with anyone who appreciates detailed history, and check out our other breakdowns for more.